The lawyer's voice echoed through the quiet office like a slow, deliberate hammer. The apartment in Boston, 3 bedrooms, located at 412 Tremont, shall be passed to Caleb Moore. I didn't blink, didn't breathe. My brother leaned back in his leather chair, one arm slung lazily over the side, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in that familiar smirk. The same one he used when we were kids, and he'd get away with breaking things and blaming it on me. Nothing had changed, not even here, not even now. I sat stiffly, my hands clutched together in my lap, heart hammering in my chest like it was trying to escape. The scent of old paper and mildew hung heavy in the room, thick as the dust floating in the morning sunbeams, slicing through the blinds. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, coughed into his sleeve, and continued. And the property located in Willow Creek, Vermont, including the residence and all surrounding outbuildings and land, shall be passed to Evelyn Moore. That was it. No elaboration, no explanation, just a line in a document that shifted the entire weight of my existence. I blinked hard. Willow Creek, a place I hadn't seen since I was 6, a sagging, weathered house in a forgotten town that barely had cell reception. I couldn't even picture the inside. Just fog, trees, a rusted mailbox. I hadn't thought about it in decades. Caleb chuckled under his breath. "Well, at least you got something," he said, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "Better than nothing. I mean, it's basically firewood, but I guess that's poetic for a librarian." The words hit like glass splinters, but I didn't flinch. I'd learned long ago not to give Caleb the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply stood, nodded to the lawyer, took the envelope of documents and keys, and walked out like the floor wasn't crumbling under me. Derek was waiting outside. He didn't bother looking up from his phone. "So," he asked, tone already laced with disappointment. I told him. Every word made his face tighten like a screw being turned too far. "You're kidding," he finally spat. "He gets a condo in the city, and you get a shack. Jesus, Evelyn, can you for once do something that doesn't drag us down?" I stared at him. The man I'd married 10 years ago. The man I'd supported through 3 job changes and 2 failed business ventures. The man I cooked for, cleaned for, defended to my parents, even when he didn't deserve it. And now, the man who looked at me like I was a burden he'd been forced to carry. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I didn't exactly choose what I'm done," he cut me off. "I'm not wasting another year on your dead-end luck. Pack your things. You're not coming back to the apartment." Something inside me cracked, clean and sharp, like a bone snapping under pressure. Not from his words, but from how familiar they felt. How unsurprising. He didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't ask how I felt. He just saw a missed opportunity. A bad investment. I walked home that afternoon in a fog, the city sounds blurring into a low, indistinct roar. I didn't cry. Not then. I packed a single suitcase, stuffed in 2 sweaters, 3 books, and a half-empty journal. I didn't say goodbye. I left the apartment key on the kitchen counter, took the keys to a house I didn't remember, and booked the next bus to Vermont. There was nowhere else to go. I stared out the window of that Greyhound as skyscrapers gave way to suburbs and suburbs to sleepy hills. It was early spring, but the trees still looked bare and cold. My mind swirled with questions I couldn't answer. Why did Grandma Eleanor do this? Why give the best to Caleb and hand me the wreckage? Was it punishment, pity, or something else entirely? All I had now were the keys, a legal envelope, and a whisper of a memory from a time before Caleb started getting everything, and I became invisible. Willow Creek was still hours away, and I didn't know what waited for me there. A collapsed porch? Mold? Nothing? I didn't know who I was without Derek, without a plan, without a single damn thing to prove I mattered to anyone. But maybe, just maybe, I'd find out. The bus rattled down a cracked 2-lane road, dipping and groaning with every pothole. I sat near the back, pressed against the window, arms wrapped tightly around myself, even though it wasn't cold. The overhead lights flickered with each bump, casting fleeting shadows on the faces of strangers who, like me, had somewhere to run or nowhere else to go. I hadn't spoken to anyone in hours. Not the woman with the crying toddler. Not the man who smelled like cigarette ash and licorice. Just me and the glass pane smeared with fingerprints, watching the world change from steel and glass to pine trees and fog. It was almost midnight when the bus driver announced Willow Creek. I looked up like I'd heard a ghost's name. The town sign was barely legible. The paint had chipped away and vines curled around the wooden posts like they'd been trying to pull the thing down for years. The bus hissed as it slowed, brakes squealing like they were protesting. I stepped off into silence. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and something older, wood rot, maybe, or earth that hadn't been turned in a long time. Streetlights buzzed faintly above cracked pavement. No one was there to meet me. Of course not. Who would be? I stood with my suitcase at my feet, looking down the empty road that led to the old house. I didn't have GPS service anymore. No Uber. No map. Just a vague memory of a gravel path and the sound of my grandmother's voice reading fairy tales by candlelight. I started walking. The path was barely visible beneath moss and thyme. Branches clawed at my coat as if trying to hold me back. My shoes were soaked before I'd gone 10 steps, and my arm ached from dragging the suitcase across uneven earth. But I kept going. What else was I supposed to do? I hadn't been to Willow Creek since I was a little girl. I remembered trees taller than buildings and silence, so heavy it made your ears ring. I remembered my grandmother's house sitting at the edge of a wooded clearing, crooked porch steps, and a blue rocking chair that never stopped creaking, even when no one sat in it. My memories were faded and strange. One summer visit, a storybook world, then never again. When the house came into view, I stopped in my tracks. It looked smaller than I remembered. Not destroyed, but tired. The paint had peeled away in long strips. The shutters hung crooked like broken wings. The grass had turned into a forest of weeds. And yet it was still standing, still waiting. I half expected to find a raccoon in the mailbox and a tree growing through the kitchen. But when I stepped onto the porch, the wood held. It creaked beneath me, but it held. I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. No alarms. No das clod. No immediate collapse. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and something faintly floral, lavender maybe. I flicked the light switch near the door, not expecting much. To my shock, it worked. A low, yellow glow filled the front room, illuminating walls lined with faded wallpaper and furniture that looked preserved. Not just untouched, maintained. The place didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like someone had just stepped out and forgotten to come back. The living room was small but warm. A love seat, a worn rug, a side table with a glass doily still perfectly centered. I walked through the house in a daze, trailing my fingertips along surfaces that had no dust, no cobwebs. The sheets on the bed upstairs were tucked with care. The dishes in the cabinet were spotless. There was even a jar of tea bags still sealed, labeled in my grandmother's neat handwriting. I couldn't make sense of it. Eleanor Hart had died nearly a year ago. No one was supposed to be taking care of this place. And yet, it was as if she knew I'd come back. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my suitcase drop to the floor. My legs ached. My heart even more. I wasn't sure what I was doing there. This house didn't belong in my world anymore. And yet it was the only thing that hadn't pushed me away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered downstairs, lit a candle I found in the drawer, and curled up in the rocking chair I remembered from childhood. It creaked under my weight, just like it always had. I stared into the shadows and whispered, "Why did you bring me here, Grandma?" The house didn't answer, but something inside me stirred, something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. I woke just after dawn, still curled up in the rocking chair. My back ached, my neck stiff, but for the first time in days I felt rested, at least emotionally. The quiet outside was unnerving, but also strangely peaceful. No honking horns, no Derek yelling through a door, no city buzz under my skin. Just birdsong and the creak of wood as the house breathed with the wind. I made tea with the old electric kettle, surprised again when the power worked. The hot water hissed over the tea bag and released the faint scent of chamomile. As I stood there, waiting for it to steep, I noticed something odd across the room. A seam in the wall just beyond the kitchen, where the paint didn't quite match. It looked like a door, but there was no handle. Curiosity stirred in me like a long-dormant instinct. I placed the cup down and walked over, brushing my fingers across the surface. The outline was faint, nearly invisible, but it was there. A rectangular panel, maybe 6 feet tall and narrow, almost flush with the wall. I pushed lightly. Nothing. I pushed harder. Still nothing. Then I remembered the small key that had come with the others in the envelope from the lawyer. I retrieved it, turned it slowly in a tiny notch just above the baseboard, and with a sharp metallic click, the panel gave way. The door creaked open, and cold air spilled out like a breath held too long. I blinked into darkness. The smell hit me first: paper, ink, leather, and time. It was intoxicating. I stepped inside, lighting the flashlight app on my phone. My breath caught. Books. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall. Rows upon rows of books. Not just a storage space. This was a hidden library. Shelves made of dark walnut groaned under the weight of thick tomes in every language I recognized, and several I didn't. Leather-bound volumes with gold embossing, paperbacks in delicate condition, old journals tied in string. A rolling ladder leaned against one shelf like it had been left mid-use. There were no windows, but small ventilation holes near the ceiling kept the air surprisingly fresh. I stood in the center of the room, stunned. My grandmother, Eleanor Hart, the woman I'd thought of as a quiet widow with a love for lavender and shortbread, had curated a private library, a hidden archive, preserved in silence for who knows how long. I ran my hand across the spines. Some were brittle with age, others soft and warm under my fingers. My fingertips tingled from the textures, some embossed, others hand-stitched. Titles in Latin, French, Russian, German. One shelf was entirely in Greek. I pulled out a volume bound in red leather. The date on the first page was 1476. I nearly dropped it. This wasn't just a hobby. This was a collection of historical significance. And no one knew it existed, not Caleb, not the lawyer, not even Derek, who would have sold it off piece by piece for cash without blinking. Why did she hide this? Why did she leave it to me? I sat down on a wooden stool near the corner and tried to breathe through the rush of questions. I remembered being 5 years old, curled up in my grandmother's lap, as she read aloud from old storybooks, tales of forests and lost cities and magical doors. I thought it was just make-believe, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe the stories were clues. The more I looked around, the more deliberate it all felt. The lighting, the preserved air, the locked door perfectly camouflaged. This room was meant to be found, but only by someone who would understand it. Someone who would see more than value, someone who would feel the heartbeat inside these pages. That thought alone undid me. I leaned back against the wall and stared at the rows above me. My throat tightened. She saw me. She knew. All my life I'd felt invisible. Next to Caleb, next to Derek, next to anyone louder, richer, more confident. I was the quiet one, the bookworm, the forgettable background character. But here, in this room, I was everything. I was the legacy. Tears slipped down my cheeks before I realized I was crying. Not from pain this time, but from recognition. From the overwhelming weight of being seen. Really, truly seen. For the first time in what felt like years. I didn't know what I would do next. But I knew this. The house wasn't just shelter. The library wasn't just paper and ink. And my grandmother hadn't left me scraps. She'd left me her soul. Later that afternoon, while the wind whispered through the trees outside and sunlight flickered through the curtains, I found myself back in the library pacing. I had only scratched the surface. My mind couldn't let it go. This place wasn't just a hidden archive. It was intentional. It was sacred. And I had a feeling there was still more buried beneath these walls. So I searched. I opened every drawer, shifted rugs, peeked behind shelves. And then, in the hallway just off the kitchen, beneath a loose floorboard I stepped on by accident, I heard a hollow sound. My pulse quickened. I pried it up. There, in a shallow recess, sat an old metal handle. I pulled. A staircase, narrow, wooden, descending into darkness. I grabbed the same flashlight from earlier and slowly crept down the steps, each one creaking under my weight. The air grew cooler, damper, but not in a way that felt unsafe. Just old, honest, like the breath of a cellar that had waited quietly for someone to remember it. The basement was mostly empty. Just a few boxes, cobwebs in the corners, and one large object covered in thick canvas, tucked in the far right corner. I pulled the tarp back. A safe, not a modern one. This thing looked like it had survived 2 wars. It was matte black, rusted along the edges, with a combination lock and no visible hinges. I stared at it for a long time. Why would she have a safe? I tried the handle. Locked. Of course. Then a thought hit me. The key didn't work on the library. The door did. Maybe this was different. I spun the dial and hesitated. I tried my birthday. Nothing. Then hers. Still nothing. I stood there, thinking hard before it came to me like a whisper. 12-06. The day my grandfather passed. She always said she never closed that chapter. I dialed in the numbers, hand shaking slightly. Click. The safe opened with a groan, metal grinding against metal like it hadn't moved in years. Inside was a wooden box, old envelopes tied with twine, a stack of photographs, and several leather-bound notebooks. I carried it all upstairs, laid it out carefully on the dining table, and sat down, my breath uneven. I opened the first envelope. It was a letter addressed to me. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I've already gone and that you found the door. I gripped the paper tighter. Her handwriting, slanted, neat, with the same little curls on the Y she used in birthday cards. You're probably wondering why the apartment went to your brother, and why I left you with an old house full of ghosts and creaking floorboards. I want you to understand this wasn't about fairness, not in the way the world defines it. Caleb always measured things in dollars and square footage. But you, Evelyn, you always listened between the lines. I paused, swallowing hard. The words blurred through tears. I didn't remember giving permission to fall. This house is more than a building. It's the spine of our family story. Every book in that library, every photograph in this safe carries blood, memory, legacy, and I knew only one person would ever care enough to protect it. My throat burned. You were never the loud one or the proud one, but you were always the heart, the observer. You understood what most people overlooked. This house doesn't need someone to fix it. It needs someone to believe in it. And I believe in you. I had to stop reading. Just for a minute. My chest ached like something old was breaking loose. Like grief and love and regret were all tangled together, finally surfacing after years underground. When I opened the notebooks, I found pages of genealogies, journal entries, reflections about books she'd read, notes about authors, quotes in the margins. She'd annotated her entire life. I flipped through the photographs. Me as a child, with a butterfly painted on my face. My grandmother holding my hand at a pumpkin patch. Me asleep on her lap, drooling into her cardigan. All the things I'd forgotten, but she hadn't. She'd remembered everything. I sat in that dining room for hours, surrounded by paper and silence, absorbing a lifetime's worth of intention. Every envelope revealed another layer. Stories about our ancestors, letters from friends I'd never met, maps with corners curled and yellowed. She'd even included expert appraisals and catalogs referencing the value of her book collection. Some were priceless, but none of it compared to the letters. because the truth was, she didn't just leave me a house. She left me a compass, a direction, a reason. And as I sat there in the fading light, hands ink-stained and heart cracked wide open, I knew something with perfect clarity. I wasn't meant to sell this house. I was meant to come home. By the time the rain started tapping on the window panes, I had lit every candle I could find in the house. The power was still holding, but something about the flickering light made the walls feel closer, warmer, like the house was exhaling, like it had waited long enough in silence. And now, finally, someone was listening. I sat cross-legged in the center of the library, letters stacked beside me, notebooks spread open across the floor like a patchwork of someone else's mind. I didn't know where to begin. Every page revealed more about her, and more about me. One journal entry, dated 20 years ago, mentioned a rare Latin manuscript she acquired from a dying professor in Maine. Another spoke of a book given to her by a visiting Hungarian scholar, a volume allegedly gifted to their family by a member of the Russian nobility. There were mentions of letters exchanged with antique dealers, handwritten appraisals, sealed certificates from institutions I had only read about in college textbooks. This wasn't just a library. It was a vault of cultural memory, and my grandmother had built it quietly, passionately, while the rest of the family argued over bank statements and real estate. I took photos of a few of the oldest titles and emailed them to an antique book dealer I found online. A woman named Catherine replied within an hour. "These are extraordinary," she wrote. "I'd like to schedule a visit, in person, as soon as possible." I didn't know whether to be excited or terrified. Part of me wanted validation, proof that this was real, that it wasn't just my grief projecting importance onto dusty objects. But another part wanted to protect it. I didn't want strangers walking through here with price tags in their eyes. Still, curiosity won. Catherine arrived 2 days later. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, with sharp eyes and soft hands that treated every book like it might shatter in her fingers. She walked through the library in silence at first, touching nothing. Then, gently, she began her work, measuring, photographing, taking notes. Finally, she turned to me and said, quietly, "You have something here that most collectors dream of. Some of these volumes haven't seen public light in a century. And this one," she held up a heavy leather-bound folio, embossed with a faded crest. "This," she whispered, "might be worth more than a condo in Manhattan." I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just burst out of me, half disbelief, half hysteria. "I'm not selling it," I said, quickly, maybe too quickly. "Any of it." She nodded. "You don't have to, but it's good to know what you have." After she left, I stood alone in the library, staring at the same book she had held. I didn't care what it was worth in money. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that for the first time in my life, I had something no one else did. Not Caleb, not Derek, me. And then the phone rang. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Caleb. I hadn't spoken to him since the reading of the will. I let it ring once, twice. On the third ring, I picked up. "Evelyn," he said, his voice all sugar and diplomacy. "How's the countryside treating you?" I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "Look, I've been thinking, maybe we didn't handle the inheritance situation the best way. Maybe we should talk about a trade." "A trade?" "Yeah. You give me the house. I'll give you the Boston condo." I blinked, then smiled. A slow, steady smile I didn't even know I was capable of. No, there was a pause. "No." "That's right. But Evelyn, the house is a wreck. You could live in the city again. Think about it." "I have," I said softly. "And I've made my choice. What could possibly be in that house worth more than a luxury condo?" I looked around the room, at the books, the letters, the memories still suspended in air. "Everything," he said. He hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I just felt certain. Later that night, I sat in front of the fireplace, flipping through an old photo album my grandmother had tucked beside her journals. There I was in a dozen different stages of childhood, chubby cheeks, missing teeth, pigtails, scraped knees, all beside her. Fishing, baking, reading, laughing, and on one photo a caption written in her hand, "My Evelyn, the one who listens." I closed the book and held it to my chest. I didn't need a city skyline or polished floors or a fake apology wrapped in real estate. I had roots now, a legacy, a story worth telling. And for the first time in a long time, I had peace. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong outside the window. The rain had passed. The light coming through the lace curtains was soft and golden, the kind of light that made everything look a little more forgiving. I stood for a long while just listening, the quiet hum of the house, the ticking of a wall clock, the world finally moving at a pace I could breathe in. I made breakfast slowly, eggs, toast, and tea. Then I took a walk through the garden out back, which had long since been overtaken by weeds and wildflowers. I pulled back vines from an old trellis, revealing a bench underneath, weathered but intact. I sat down and let the sun warm my face. I had no idea what day it was. Or maybe I did, and it just didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that for the first time in years, I wasn't rushing toward anything or away from anyone. I was simply still. Later that week, I called a local restoration expert, an older man named James who lived 2 towns over. He came by the next afternoon with a clipboard, a sharp eye, and a soft voice. "Solid bones," he said, after inspecting the foundation. "Needs love, but it's got soul." We stood on the porch as he scribbled notes. "You gonna sell it when it's done?" he asked casually. "No," I said. "I'm staying." He smiled. "Good. Place like this needs someone who understands it." Over the next few days, I met more of the townspeople. The woman at the bakery who remembered my grandmother's pecan pie. The retired history teacher who once traded books with her. The postmaster who hadn't seen the house occupied in a decade. Each one brought a new piece of her story to me, like puzzle pieces slipping into place. Turns out, Eleanor Hart had been more than just a quiet widow. She'd been a scholar, a mentor, a protector of history, and I, Evelyn Moore, had been the only one she ever trusted to carry that forward. It was a heavy gift, but it fit perfectly in my hands. I reached out to the New England Historical Society and began the process of archiving parts of the library. I wasn't ready to sell anything, but I wanted it protected, understood. They sent a woman named Dr. Miriam Cho, a preservationist with a gentle curiosity and a deep respect for family history. She spent 2 days cataloging the rarest volumes and before leaving told me, you could build something here, a private reading room, a public exhibit. This collection deserves to be seen. I thought about that all night, and by morning I had made up my mind. I wasn't just going to live here. I was going to honor it, honor her, honor me. So I turned the front room into a small reception space. I cleaned the wooden floors until they glowed. I hung photos of my grandmother, young and radiant, older and wise, beside sketches of the original property. I posted a small sign near the gate, Hart House Library by appointment only. I didn't need crowds. I just needed presence. A month later, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address. I knew the handwriting instantly. "Caleb." Inside, a single sentence. "I hope you know what you're doing." I folded it once, twice, then tossed it in the fireplace. The flames curled around the paper like it had been waiting for release. Yes, I knew exactly what I was doing. That night, I made tea and settled into the blue armchair in the corner of the library, the same one my grandmother used to sit in when she read aloud. I opened a small, cloth-bound book in Latin I still couldn't fully translate, and read anyway, because this wasn't about perfect understanding. It was about devotion, about presence, about memory. And as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the shelves, I felt something in the air, quiet but certain, a sense that I had not just inherited a house. I had stepped into my place in a story much larger than myself. I was no longer invisible. I was the continuation. I was the one who listened. I was the one who stayed. I was the legacy. And that was enough.